Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're talking sustainability in the agricultural supply chains. Agriculture accounts for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions and 70% of global freshwater usage. And with a growing population, the twin challenge is both to make it more sustainable, but also meet growing production needs to feed the world. How far on that journey are we? What are the solutions in place? What are the drivers and pressures that farmers and the agricultural supply chains face? Our guest is Robert Horster. Robert is the Global Sustainability Director for Agricultural Supply Chains and Head of Environmental Markets for Cargill. As always, you can really support the show by recommending it to a colleague and leaving us a positive review or 5 stars on the platform you're listening on. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here.
So we've got quite a challenging subject today, which is essentially sustainability or delivering sustainability into the agricultural supply chains, an area which your career is currently focused on. I guess before we dig into some of the drivers behind this change and some of the solutions and frameworks for us to think about, it'd be good to kind of get a lay of the land on the scale of the challenge that we face in delivering, food and at the same time making it sustainable.
Yeah, I think so. It's a great question to start with because the scale of the challenge and the current lay of the land is actually quite complex if you think about it, and the scale of the challenge is significant. So just to give you a flavor, first of all, I guess if you just to scope it out, we're talking about the food system here, right? And I think the challenge that the food system faces today, and Cargill being an important player within that food system, is that we need to both increase food production and do it in a more sustainable way, right? So reduce carbon emissions, if you will, if you had to sort of condense it into one thing we need to do. So increase food production and then reduce carbon emissions. But I would add to that, if you think about agriculture, which is essentially the food producing machine, we also need to think about water, right? So the food system today is responsible for about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. That includes transportation and the actual growing of the crops. And then there's the additional draw on 70% of our freshwater reserves, right? So if you think about it in terms of emitter of greenhouse gas and consumer of water, it's a significant factor that we need to tackle. At the same time, that system needs to grow to feed about 2 billion people in addition to what we have today in about 25 years, right? So you can see the size of the challenge right there.
And I guess that food consumption and thereby the water consumption, which is 70%, is an astonishing number, and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, that food consumption is also not linear, right? Just, at the same time, more and more people are coming out of poverty. As people progress through economic development, there's a change in food and dietary habits, typically towards more protein, and that itself then compounds the issue. Is that a fair statement?
That's a very fair statement. It's there's ample research out there that suggests that once you're at the inflection point of a country coming out of poverty, as you rightly say, and then you get this growth of middle class consumers, there's an exponential growth of consumption and processed food. So you think about everything you and I eat, as a Western consumer. I mean, there's an exponential growth in that. And there's a multiplier in there too, right? Because you think about some conversion factors you think about feed to meat conversion factors, to produce a kilogram of beef, you need 7 kilograms of animal feed, for instance, right? And then there's, if you grow a ton of wheat, there's 16 tons of water needed to grow that wheat. So it's that type of magnitude that you need to think about. That's the multiplier. And then the other thing is the sheer growth in numbers of middle-class consumers. India, as an example, adds 35 million middle-class consumers every year to its population. right? So that's not just people, it's people who can actually afford processed food. So that's twice the size of the Netherlands, right? Just talk about my own country.
There's another layer of complexity here as well, because as we're going through climate change and essentially greater climate volatility, more intense events more frequently around the planet, and we saw that this year. We had Walter Cronin on talking about just the crop, the yields that are being impacted around the world. As the climate shifts, food production also becomes more fragile and more challenging as well.
Yes, that's a very fair statement. So that needs to happen as well. So so if you double click on the on what needs to happen as you grow, as you think about how you grow food, not only do you need to decarbonize, you need to make the system as a whole more resilient to things like climate change, to your point, right? So it's both and. It's not just a choice.
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked about water. What about on the soil side as well? That soil depletion and that piece, because that's also critical to, I guess, some of the solutions we're going to talk to down the line.
Well, yeah, we're going to talk about this later, I guess. But if you think about the soil health, monoculture, this is a broad statement, right? So it's not necessarily true for every geography, for every crop. But monoculture doesn't do a lot of good things for biodiversity. In fact, it does the opposite. And so it depletes, if you just grow the same crop year after year on the same land, and you farm it in the same way, you're going to be depleting the land, right, of its essential nutrients. And so and I'm sure we'll speak about this later, but there's solutions out there that not necessarily prescribe, but that suggest that you can grow the food in a different way, right? By, through crop rotation and so on and so forth. We'll talk about those practices later. But the intent is to increase the soil health. And as you increase the soil health, you're going to make the soil more resistant. And as you think about it in terms of how would I look at this in terms of yield, it takes out the high and the low, probably, right? It doesn't necessarily, but it certainly takes out the low in the sense that in years of drought, the crop is more resilient, and therefore the food system that is more resilient because it is resistant to drought and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I just want to talk briefly about the farmers as well, but just going back to that greenhouse gas emissions, that 30% number. Where can you just give us some sense of, actually, that's an enormous number. Where is that primarily coming from?
So transportation is a piece, right? But it's actually the emissions of greenhouse gases that happen when you grow the crop, when you plow the land, when you apply fertilizer, and so on and so forth. So that's where the emissions come from.
Yeah. Okay, and then on the farmers' side as well, because this is, and in this is there sort of a microcosm of the broader challenge that actually we were just talking about before we came live, is you've got somewhat of a mismatch between short-term incentives and longer-term incentives, right? So today, obviously, the farmer needs to, faces financial pressures, needs to get the best yield they possibly can. That probably means exhausting the soil. Whereas over the long term, you've got a different suite of incentives around actually the investments that are needed to start building sustainability into their agricultural practices, so that the land survives for longer, takes more crops, etc. How has this challenge and scale of the challenge, can you contextualize it in with respect to farmers around the world as well? I mean, they've got local pressures, they've got annual pressures, etc., as well as longer term pressures.
Well, I think so. First of all, I think just speaking philosophically, we see farmers as part of the solution of what we're going to talk about later, right? But also what we talked about at the beginning is if you want to produce more food, that's what farmers do. And if you want to decarbonize our food system, that's what farmers can do. Right. But to your question on the challenges that farmers are facing is, so first of all, I think there's downstream a lot of demand, from companies going out there and saying, we have climate goals, for instance, right? So that's one thing. Those climate goals typically revolve around, greenhouse gas, and sometimes there's something about water, sometimes there's something about land use, but at the end of the day, it comes down to, how farmers grow crops, right? In some cases, so so farmers are faced with the demand downstream from corporates, downstream from where they sit, from corporates who have climate commitments. So that's number one. I think number two is there's evolving legislation. Now, depending, of course, which geography you're speaking about, and since I'm sitting in Europe, I'm closest to what's happening here in the European Union, and there's tons of legislation out there, right? Whether it's for imported goods such as the EUDR, the deforestation regulation, or whether it's the Green Deal, right? That puts requirements onto how food is grown. If you just focus on food production here for a minute, how food is grown. But there's legislation everywhere. There's a carbon law in Brazil. There's LCFS in North America, and so many countries, many pieces of legislation. So that's second. Third, I guess, is evolving science, right? So even if we're just getting ready just to get the farmer, work with the farmer to meet those climate commitments downstream from where the farmer sits, and even if you're ready to tackle that legislation, then still there is the ever evolving field of scientific insights as to what is good farming practices, right? So that's one thing I think which is relevant for this conversation. The farmer himself, him or herself, needs to diversify as well. So the farmer is a businessman or businesswoman. I think we often we often forget that in our conversations, but the farmer runs a business, and so there is a natural need to diversify as normal businesses would. I would say there's a need to be more sustainable. I mean, nobody wants to be more sustainable than the farmer, because at the end, I visited farmers in Brazil in May and of this year, and the farmers were saying to me, "Look, I've been farming in a sustainable manner for the last 4 generations, or we've been farming for the last 4 generations. We've been watching land conversion, we've been doing water conservation, we've been looking at row crops and crop rotation and everything else." So they're doing it already, right? So that's what the natural tendency of the farmer is, right? And so we're just cognizant of the fact that you need to leverage that. You need to you're not starting from scratch, in other words. And then finally, there's the visibility. I think, and what I mean by visibility is that there's a demand downstream and frankly speaking, also upstream, right? And also from regulators to see, where do crops come from, right? So what's the provenance of your palm oil, of your soybean oil, of your cocoa beans, of your coffee, right? So there's the traceability and the tracking and the tracing, if you will, that exposes the entire food system. So those are the five or six trends here that I think that the farmer is having to deal with, right? And with him or her, the companies that work in agriculture like Cargill.
Yeah, yeah, that was a fascinating exposition. I want to draw two of those out,
Yeah.
namely that sort of the visibility piece.
Hmm.
But firstly, can we just talk about that legislation? Because it is, as you described at the moment, for the most part, a patchwork. Are we seeing, perhaps, going forwards, are we seeing a coalescence around sort of agreed policies on a global basis? Are those various legislations starting to intertwine? Because that is a big headache for large farmers and the agribusiness itself to navigate, I assume.
Yeah, to your question, is it converging? Do we see a global legislative framework emerging? No. Do some of the systems starting to look alike? Yes. You think about biofuels and just ignore the time element here, because I think Europe was ahead of everybody else, I guess, in terms of biofuel legislation. But what we're seeing, for instance, in North America and some states in the US or some provinces in Canada, that is starting to look very much like where Europe is heading as well, right? So it's converging, if you will, but it's not exactly the same, right? You and I were talking before we started recording about the carbon markets. There's 16 countries, I think, by my latest count, that have an emerging carbon legislation, right? Brazil is one of them. What Brazil is developing doesn't look very dissimilar to what China is developing, but it looks different, right? Because so different countries, different types of legislation. There is no global framework today, I guess, for any of the things we talked about. So I think that's the direct answer to your question, but they're starting to converge in the sense that your governments are trying to tackle the same thing.
And then on that visibility piece, you spoke about, obviously there's significant pressures, sort of upstream of the supply chain, with whether that's through legislation, scope 3 emissions, etc., and investors, that whole piece that we talk about a lot. Are we seeing, I guess, on the other side of the supply chain, a willingness from the end consumer to pay more for sustainable attributes, as aside from organic attributes, etc., but really willing to pay more for an egg if it's been sustainably farmed compared to another one?
It's a great question, and it's also a broad question, because I think you need to think about, okay, so what sustainable attribute are we talking about? So I'll give you two extremes, right? So traceability or deforestation, or no deforestation, rather no conversion. I mean, that's becoming table stakes. and rightfully so, right? So you have to have the confidence as a consumer that the forest has not been taken down, right, for your good that you're consuming. But then there's already a nuance right there, right? Because you think about Brazil, a country we talked about earlier. I mean, Brazil has, I mean, in the Brazilian Forest Code, which is one of the strongest legislative frameworks around natural vegetation and globally, the farmer still has the right to convert because the farmer has the right to build a livelihood. So then you think about the European legislation, you think about, hey, you know what, no goods can come in from, this is the EUDR, no goods can come in if they've been grown on deforested land. So that's at odds right there. So in terms of the traceability, do people actually pay for this? Not when it's becoming table stakes, not when it's becoming legislation. Legislation has the tendency to create a level playing field. But I would say everything over and above table stakes or everything over and above legislation has the potential to extract a premium. So when you think about the example of Brazil, right, I would say that, okay, so the goods that come in from Brazil have to be deforestation free. But if on top of that, there would be an attribute around granular traceability, right? Or the good has been organically or regeneratively grown, or there's more attributes you can think about in terms of livelihoods, right? So then consumers are willing to pay, and sometimes that appears front of pack, sometimes it's sort of expected or implied. But in cocoa, we've had that example where the deforestation aspect has been a lot, in fact, has been commoditized in the cocoa sector, but there's still brands and companies out there that can actually extract a premium for what they do, right? And the same is true for palm. So it's a long-winded answer to your question. Are
No,
consumers willing to pay? Yes, but it depends on what they're paying for, right? And sometimes it's a narrative, sometimes it's a real claim, sometimes it's something that comes with the legislation but is over and above the legislation. So
yeah,
it
I
depends.
find that topic sort of fascinating, and I think it's been interesting to see how that plays out over the next decade, and obviously how it's being impacted today by inflation. You know, where some of these attributes people just can't afford to pay for, right, or aren't willing to in this type of environment. There's probably, to add to your five, is there a sixth, which is for these companies in the supply chain, whether or not it's in, if it's not in current legislation, you might still need to be thinking clearly about this just to be able to participate in the supply chains that you want to, right? You know, a lot of this stuff is now being mandated, as you said, by companies. And just to participate in those supply chains, you need to be able to demonstrate your sustainability credentials and compliance and so forth. Can you just give us some sense about how, I guess, the supply chain itself is kind of self-policing and working towards a more sustainable outcome, if indeed it is?
Yeah, so maybe one example would be the palm sector, right? And so the palm sector, if you recall, in 2015, 2016, there was this massive attack on the sector, and when I say attack, that sounds very negative, but there was this, the sector was under scrutiny for deforestation, and I was part of those debates in the early days where basically downstream consumers were saying, okay, you have to stop the deforestation, and this was this was directed at the entire sector. And so what the sector did, there was, at the time, you had already the roundtable for sustainable palm oil, but as a sector, we felt it wasn't necessarily covering all aspects of sustainability. And so two things happened at the same time. RSPO as an organization saw that and said, okay, we need to have something like RSPO plus. In fact, I think that's what they called it, which was, just principles and criteria over and above the existing principles and criteria. So that would tackle a number of concerns. And at the same time, there was a movement, if for lack of a better word here, Paul, that I would call NDPE, right? Which is no deforestation, no development on peatland, and respect for human rights, which was a sector imposed. You call it self-policing. I think that's probably the better term. And so what happened is that we said, okay, so as a sector, we commit to NDPE. So we will be ourselves designing and implying policies that have NDP as at its core, and we won't be buying anymore from companies that don't have it. And so, you fast forward to 2023, and I think that the vast majority of plantations out there, plantation companies, have an NDPE policy, and also have the policy supplier code of conduct, if you will, not to buy from companies that don't sign up to NDPE. I think that was a great example of how the industry self-policed because it wasn't necessary in response to genuine consumer demands and customer demands, right? Just let's be clear. But also it wasn't happy itself with the certification that existed. Now RSPO still happily exists, right? And so there's a fair percentage of palm oil that gets traded today under RSPO terms. But then I would say on top of that or next to it, you have NDPE that the vast majority has signed up to.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so let's move towards, I guess, the chunk of this episode really on the current trends and solutions that are out there both today and kind of where you see those particular tracks to tackle this dual problem, which is intimately intertwined between increasing food to meet growing demand of a growing global population, but at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also ensuring that there's sustainability around water, which I think is, as we would all agree, is going to become a very important topic over the next 20 years, and soils and so forth.
Maybe to look at, if as food moves, what happens, right? And so roughly there's three sources of emissions, right? There's the growing of the food, there's the growing of the crops, right, which happens on the land, so at the farm gate, if you will. There's the transportation that happens to the first point of collection, to the export elevator, then they say ocean transport and so on. And there's the processing of the goods as they reach final destination, right? And so all three are emitters of greenhouse gas. And in some way, certainly 1 and 3, so the growing and the processing, consume water or use water. And all three need to be tackled, right? All three need to be you need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in all three in order to abate emissions from the food system. We talked about regenerative agriculture only really briefly, but so let's dig into this. So at the end of the day, we believe that there's a lot of discussion about regenerative agriculture, and I don't think there's one definition of regenerative agriculture, regen ag. It also depends who you speak with. I mean, you've got the purists, let's say academia, and they need to be pure in how they approach the science. I mean, they'll say, regen ag, they're finding definitions for what regen ag is. And you go to the corporates, and even within the corporate sector, there's varying opinions on what regen ag actually is, right? And so, what is a regen ag system? What does it look like? But roughly speaking, I would say there's three pillars, if you will, on which regen ag rests. So one is the actual practices that the farmer can implement and that he needs to be incentivized for. Two is then the fertilizer, the application of fertilizer on the field. And three would be then the chemicals, right? So let's say the weed control and so on and so forth. Also there you need to think about how does that emit greenhouse gas and what can I do? So if you double click on regen ag, so that's one of the things we should look at. But the ultimate goal, I think everybody has an opinion on regen ag, but I think the ultimate goal of regen ag that we have very little disagreement on is that it increases the soil health, or that it should increase the soil health is what I should say. Now, then your next question is going to be, okay, so what is soil health, right? How do you define that? You can define that academically. You could start very practically and say, what are the proxies for soil health? Because soil health as an entity, if you will, is very difficult to define or to sort of scope even. So I would say if you take the proxy route, you would say one of the things you could do is soil organic carbon measurement. You can think about biodiversity above the ground and underground. You can think about water, and you can think about other emissions, right? But you have to baseline essentially the field and say, so what is business as usual? And then if I do regen ag, the three pillars that I just talked about, so how does that influence emissions? There is emerging science on what soil health might be, and then you think about soil organic matter, right? And how you define that. But I think it's, well, A, for the audience that we're speaking to today, and B, for the the length of this conversation, it's probably going to be too deep to talk about that. But that's basically what if you go back to what regen ag tries to do, it tries to increase the soil health, but it does more. It is so because we talked about resilience, right? And at the beginning of this podcast, and so it increases the resilience of the land, such that when you have a drought, when you have an extreme weather event, the farmer can still achieve a reasonable yield for his or her crop.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
Can you give us some kind of examples? And I guess a lot of this is technology driven as well. This is this idea of kind of going from the field to the individual plant, even to the molecular level, from a farming, from a fertilizing, from a chemical standpoint. Can you just give us sort of some sense of how much effort is going into this? Is Regen Ag a real thing today, or is it still sort of as you say, it's loosely defined by different organizations and therefore essentially can mean nothing at all in some organizations? Give us some sense of kind of where we are and how much investment is going in, and kind of where some examples perhaps of the technologies that you see being implemented.
So your first question on how big is it? I don't have exact numbers, but it is definitely beyond a trend or a fad. Basically we're saying it is real. It is being implemented in North America. It is being implemented by ourselves and by our competitors and by other people active in our space, in the agricultural space. And it is a significant number of acres. It's in the millions, and multiple millions of acres are being grown. Have been converted to regenerative practices. Europe, same thing. We've got a few actors active there, including ourselves. Australia, we're starting to scratch the surface here a little bit in Brazil, although you would say their regenerative farming practices have been business as usual. So you need to think about other things that constitute regenerative farming. We can talk about that if you like. And China, it's the same. It's also starting, right? So it's globally, I would say it's more than a hype, right? It is real. It is here. And the reason why it is real is because farmers see the benefits. Now, clearly, as you design these programs, you need to meet the farmers where they are. So some farmers have already, like my example on Brazil, don't go to the farmers in Brazil and talk to them about carbon, because they've been sequestering carbon for the last, like these farmers that I met, for the last 4 generations. So you need to do other things. Same we experienced in Australia, where farmers are used to dryland farming, and so you think about, so what are the other things you could do? Don't talk about carbon, but let's start with a baseline of what your emissions are, and then build from there. There's places in Europe where you could start with you can lead with the carbon, because we're not doing enough yet, right, to sequester that carbon. Which brings me to the techniques the second part of your question is, basically, if you think about, again, the system of Regen Ag, you think about practices, fertilizer use, and chemicals. You think about the practices. There's a number of practices, and there's a list of, I don't know, the latest list I've seen was like 12 or 15 different practices, but the big ones are no-till or limited till of the land, planting cover crops in between 2 harvests, and then there's the, something you can do with the fertilizer, right? So basically then crop rotation is part of that. So if you think about where farmers are, and our philosophy has always been, you need to meet the farmers where they are. You shouldn't come with a list of things, here's what you should do, and then I'll go pay you a premium. You got to sit down with the farmer, which is what we do in Europe and in North America, and basically let him or her talk and say, so what are you doing? What are you already doing, right? If you're doing cover cropping, if you're doing no-till, if you have a good rotation of your crops, then maybe we need to start thinking about other things. But that's sort of I don't want to say the low-hanging fruit, because it is definitely something that needs to be done, thoughtfully and mindfully with the farmers. But it's the easier practices you can implement if a farmer is not doing anything at this point.
Mm. And for our edification, do these typically lead to rising costs, or are they cost neutral, or are they actually cost saving, these practices, in terms of if you are actually able to reduce the amount of chemicals or fertilizer that a farmer's consuming to maintain the same yields?
It's both, right? But then I would say farmers, so in terms of sequencing, if you will, farmers are investing ahead of value, and we'll be there. So as we think about our own program, which is called Regen Connect, or Sustain Connect in Australia, which is its cousin, we are there with the farmer to work with the farmer and say, look, I mean, yeah, we know you're investing ahead of value, but we're providing hopefully, and this is how most systems work actually, but we're providing a line of sight to a future increase in soil health, resilience of your crop, potentially crop yield increases, again, depending on where the farmer is in the journey, but also the soil type and the climate and so on and so forth. But more importantly, because when you talk about savings, you think about water use, right? What regenerative farming does typically is it increases the water holding capacity of the land. The easiest way, I was at a farm recently and they explained it to me. They said, look, if you increase the soil organic carbon in the ground, you're actually expanding the root system, and roots have the tendency to create these little wormholes. And so you make so little holes in the ground, literally, right? And then the land becomes a sponge. That when there's a soaking rain, it soaks up all the water, and there's no runoff, right? So you achieve two things: you reduce the chemical runoff because farmers use chemicals, and second, you hold the water in the ground, you hold the nutrients there. So then the farmer saves immediately on his water bill. But there might be an investment ahead of time ahead of value in terms of the equipment that a farmer needs to buy, right? Because no-till means you're not gonna till the land, which basically means you're pushing the seeds literally into the soil. Well, folks like John Deere, they've developed equipment that can actually do precisely that, but you need to buy that equipment or at least lease it with a group of farmers, right? So it's a little bit of both. I mean, there's savings, there's costs, but at the end of the day, then the farmer will say net, this might cost me money. And then you need to talk about incentives, which I guess we can talk about next. But that's basically what Regen Ag, that's a typical conversation you would have with a farmer when you speak about Regen Ag.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just touch on those incentives now, and then we'll move on to the transportation piece.
Okay. Yeah. So the incentives then, at the end of the day, most Regen Ag programs that we see around the world are leading with carbon. And what I mean by that is it's about the carbon sequestration. Some programs have evolved already from there, but let's start with the carbon, because it's not just about the carbon, it's also serves as an example. So by increasing the soil organic matter, you increase the soil organic carbon in the ground. So you hold the carbon essentially where it is in the root system. So the root system is where the carbon sits and where the nutrients are consumed. If you plant the cover crops, basically you're going to keep the root system in the ground, and if you don't plow or you don't till, you're going to keep the root system in the ground. So not only does that abate emissions, because when you plow, you're going to be increasing those emissions, or actually you're letting the greenhouse gas, you're releasing it, if you will. So by keeping everything in the ground, there you increase the soil organic carbon, and you can measure that. You can measure that in three different ways, and typically it's not one or the other. It's a triangulation of three measurements. You can do remote sensing. Then you have a model that where you fill in basically the characteristics of your climate and your soil and everything else, and that model spits out a potential baseline. And then there's the sampling. So every 100 yards or every 100 meters, you take a sample, and it's a self-reinforcing loop, if you will, right? So you do the sampling that teaches the satellite what it actually sees, right? And then there's the software in there that actually says, okay, so now I'm seeing what the sample is telling me, and this goes into a model and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, there's a measurement of the carbon that is being kept in the ground, and if that increases, the farmer might, through measurement and verification, might demonstrate that he's actually doing what the practices are promising, which is the regenerative practices are promising to increase the soil organic carbon. Similar to a carbon offset, it's not a carbon offset, but similar to a carbon offset, there's an equivalent value of that carbon that you keep in the ground. As long as that travels within the supply chain, so it goes to the farmer, to a company like Cargill, and then it goes to one of our customers, it stays within the supply chain, and you call it a carbon inset, right? I guess that's the way to think about it, as it stays in the supply chain. It's embedded in your supply chain, so it's a carbon inset. So you pay for the carbon that the farmer sequesters, so because you should see the carbon go up. So the farmer needs to agree to permanence. So just don't change your practices. Keep the organic carbon in there, and then the supply chain, so downstream for the customer, it pays for that. It literally pays for the carbon that is sequestered in some way or form, right? You can do it, and you can take it in many different ways, but in some way or form, there's a payment associated with how much carbon the farmer sequesters. That is the incentive.
Yeah, obviously there's incentives, as I understand, on saving water, etc. Not having to pay for more. But just on that carbon piece, is that essentially what you're saying is there's a mechanism somewhere in every jurisdiction that a farmer can receive those incentives, or are there kind of lacunae within that, or just help understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's not based on legislation. There's no legislative framework today that actually mandates that you have to pay for the carbon sequestered. It's an agreement as a supply chain, right? It's an agreement between the downstream customer and ourselves. And then between ourselves and the farmer. But the system agrees on doing these practices and incentivizing the farmer to do this, because we're all, and this comes back to what we talked about earlier. So if you think about the climate goals that the corporates have out there, all the corporates have, I mean, not all, but most corporates have agreed to some type of emission reduction in their supply chain. And so this is one way to reduce emissions, namely by sequestering the carbon that would otherwise be released by growing the crop, by keeping it in the ground, through regenerative practices. So there's no legislative framework, but there is a commercial agreement, if you will, that happens.
This is part of the challenge here at the moment, right, where you do have this patchwork of different, legislative compliance markets in carbon, some voluntary, etc. In that scenario where there are still some agri-businesses that don't incentivize that, and thereby presumably overall can offer a cheaper alternative, is there the risk that without having this as a baked in legislation, the table stakes, as you mentioned, that there are incentives to not do these type of practices? Is that a fair comment?
So I'll say two things, and I'll take two extremes of what you're saying. So if as agricultural companies, right? So Cargill and its competitors, we all face the same customers, and it's the same customer base that has these climate commitments. So I think if you choose not to play, then there is the risk of losing business. So that's one extreme. So that's when you don't do it. The other extreme would be for legislation to come in, like in the EU. Brussels is considering. I mean, it's not fully baked. It's not baked at all, in fact, but this is still a debate. But Europe is considering bringing agriculture under the EU ETS, the trading system, right, for carbon emissions. That's when it becomes level playing field. But at the end of the day, if you think about it from a system perspective, right? So forget about Cargill or forget about any corporate gains, right? And from a system perspective, this is good, right? Because then you're saying, look, you're going to be incentivizing a system, through legislation where you reward farmers for being more sustainable. Now, there's tons of things you can throw at that, including, what does the legislation look like, and can it be executed? Is it enforceable, and so on and so forth? So many years will follow, from today with a lot of discussion. But in essence, right, if a large region like the EU is embedding in legislation that production of food must be more sustainable, I think that is a good thing, right, from a system perspective. So those are the two extremes, right? So you can choose not to play, but then at the end of the day, you're not serving customers, or you cannot serve your customers anymore, right? And if it's embedded in legislation, you create a level playing field. But then I would say, well, from a system perspective, that's probably a good thing to do.
Yeah, and I guess it's flipping it from sort of a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle.
Yes.
Right. Actually, these practices altogether are actually going to be, going back to the original problem, right? Presumably maintaining yields over the long term, if not boosting them, as well as requiring less water, requiring less chemicals, therefore less cost and so forth. And as legislation develops, we hope, there being an actual getting paid, as you say, for the carbon that they are sequestering.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the interest of time, we've covered transportation quite a bit more broadly on how that is going to decarbonize. Is there anything specific in the agricultural business that really is the focus at the moment, and sort of either the most egregious actor or where there's some nuances just for the sector that mean that's an emphasis?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, transportation is, 20% of emissions of the food system is transportation. So it's not something to think lightly about. You're not doing that, but I'm just saying it is a factor, right? Of it's a material emitter. emissions factor. So I would say that if you think about ocean transport, where I'm sure you've seen the news with our ocean transportation folks hitting the news with wind wings, right? Which is the wind propelled vessels. It's a great start of the decarbonization of the shipping sector.
Yes.
I mean, there's been a lot of news coverage on that. It's a great start, and when I say great start, it's you need to. So if you fast forward a few years, many years, I would say, then the cleaner fuels, right? And so what is the next generation of how you power vessels, right? It's the it's the hydrogen and the ammonia. You start thinking about what needs to be true for those fuels. Typically, I would say that if you think about it, perhaps in terms of what needs to be true, one thing that needs to be true is that the cost of emitting should go up for those fuels to become economical, and clearly also the production of those fuels should also become more economical. But it's both need to happen, but it's completely within the realm of possibilities that vessels will be dual or single powered even with cleaner fuels. I mean, it's something that we foresee, and something that is already happening today to some extent with the first generation biofuels that are being blended with fuel, even for the high seas transportation of goods, right? So use of biofuels, and then if you fast forward a few years, right, and it's the cleaner fuels such as hydrogen, ammonia. You think about road transport and barge transport. I mean, same thing, right? You could use first or second generation. Second generation would be based on waste biofuels to power those vessels, to power those barges and those trucks, and that needs to happen in addition to what we talked about in the first 40 minutes, which is how you grow food more sustainably, right? It's not a choice. So shall I do this or shall I do that? It's both need to happen, right? Because we're dangerously close to the tipping point of not reaching the 2%. I mean, the 1.5% we can probably already, I don't want to say write off, but certainly the 2%. I mean, depending on which debate you follow, right? And then the third piece, just to finish on the entire supply chain, is the processing, right? So, put simply, if you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of how you convert soybeans into soybean meal, or animal feed, right, or into soybean oil, or how you convert crude palm oil into a refined palm oil, or corn into sweeteners, I mean, there's greenhouse gas emissions right there. So reducing the greenhouse gas emissions of those processing facilities is a priority also for Cargill, right? And so we've got commitments out there. Most companies have commitments out there in terms of reducing the emissions in what they call scope 1 and 2. Green power, same thing. So, but you need to fire, I guess the message here, Paul, you need to fire on all cylinders, right, in order to abate the emissions of the entire system.
I'm fascinated by sort of some of the way that there's sort of these all add force multipliers, right? We did an episode probably I think 2 years ago now on technology driven change in farming with the chief economist of John Deere, and looking there was obviously even the farming equipment is as we get more down to that plant level is going to become electrified, but also more like a series of drones than one big heavy tractor, diesel fueled and damaging the soil. So there's it's a multi-pronged attack from all sides, right? That are driving change.
Yeah, and think about solar and wind, right? The cost of producing solar cells has gone down dramatically. I mean, like really dramatically. I cannot think of a parallel, to be honest, right, in terms of unit cost of something going down so fast. So it doesn't cost much anymore to produce a solar cell. In a country like Germany, on a good day with a lot of sun and wind, they can run for more than 100% on renewable fuel. So to your point on innovations, it's happening at country level, it's happening at the farm, and some of it is driven by the availability simply of the alternative fuels, right, the solar and the wind. But a lot of it is actually driven by the unit cost of some of those alternative sources of energy.
Yeah. I just looked it up. So episode 73, Revolutionizing Agriculture, Machines, Software and Genetics.
There you go.
From December 2021. Okay, so thanks so much for all this. I think you really put it together for us. Finally, there's lots more to talk about, but I guess you've obviously spent a long time in these markets and on this, and obviously had a career in Cargill prior to your current focus. How do you think when you step back? I mean, is there a growing crescendo from farmers, from technology, from investors, from legislation that gives you hope that in 10 years we will be meeting both the increase in food demand, but also in a more sustainable way? Can you give us, or are we still very much, there's successes here, but some losses over there kind of stage?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think there's a simple answer to this. But I would say I'm hopeful, right? Just to answer your question, and I'm hopeful because I think we're figuring out a system to reward the farmers for what they do. When you just focus on food here, but you take it a bit more broadly, you say, okay, so reward the system for what it does, right, in terms of abating emissions. So I'm hopeful. You found the system, and the system is that you've got an emergence all over the world. I've mentioned 16 countries where you have some legislation in some way or form around carbon. There's a system emerging around the world of paying for ecosystem services. We didn't talk. I mean, in my history with Cargill, the term payment for ecosystem services didn't exist 5 years ago, or maybe it existed in some obscure corners of our system, but certainly it wasn't mainstream. Today, when you speak with customers, when you go to conferences where the topic of agriculture is on the agenda, there is always the topic of emissions, right? That the two weren't necessarily linked. And then there's a need also to connect the farmers to the market. So that's where companies like Cargill come in and say, you know what, we can connect you to the market. I mean, we're not going to cough this up ourselves. This is going to be, we're going to connect you to the market. So we all are going to be for the effort you're doing. So there's a system, number one, emerging, right? And there's an infrastructure, number two, emerging. So probably the best example is the EU ETS, with the EU trading system for emissions. But there's tons of those emerging across the world, right? And so I'm hopeful that one of those will actually be in each geography leading, right? And that we have leading exchanges around the world to trade carbon and to essentially connect the landowner or the farmer with the market. Number three, I think it's the urgency, right? The urgency to tackle both climate and food security has never been more acute than today. And there's a lot of press also, right? So whichever newspaper you read, I mean, the New York Times, I mean, I subscribe to this newsletter that comes in every day around the climate, and there's very good articles in there around, okay, what needs to be done. And so we know what needs to be done. Now, the fourth factor, I think, is the movement of capital. So this is going to be an interesting one, right? So the system, the markets are there, the system is there, the notion is there that something needs to be done, and now you need the capital to move. And so I think that if you are able to express the value of sustainability and explain it in plain terms to the financial market, and in fact translate that into financial returns that are understood by the financial market and by investors, I think you've nailed it. Now, this is the hardest part. This is probably worth another podcast, but I think just in one or two sentences, I would say that there's a price and there's a value. And the price is whatever we see, that's business as usual, what we see in financial markets today. And there's the value there's the ecological return that companies are making around the world to make this a better place. And that needs to be recognized by financial markets. And so that's where I think that moves the capital, because capital moves to the highest yield. I mean, that's a given. And I don't think we should say that's a bad system. I think it's actually a great system, but you need to embrace the financial market. And it's, what Adam Smith used to say, the self-interested pursuit of profit. You need to embrace that in order to move the capital, but then to the right places where you have the highest value. And therefore, I'm not saying the highest price, but I'm saying the highest value, which, if you think about the big problems we're facing, so the two challenges that we talked about today, which is food security and decarbonization, that's where the money needs to go. So that's what the financial markets need to figure out. But I think, if you see legislation and guidance around the world emerging around disclosures, I think that's, if it's reasonable disclosures, I think that should be right around ESG, that should go out there, because that is basically then one of those elements that needs to be tackled in order to move capital towards value.
Yeah. We've obviously got the upcoming SEC legislation around emissions and so forth, and disclosures there, which will be a driver. And obviously food security, and Cargill itself has done a phenomenal job as part of this. Food is a very efficient market, right? And actually, we've just seen that over the last, the scarcities over the last couple of years, about how the market solves those problems, ultimately driven by price. And then there's this core issue is, actually at the moment the price isn't reflective of the value of sustainable attributes, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
And therefore, we're not pricing these externalities. And yes, there are companies moving the needle, self-mandating, creating these systems, but there are also others that don't have to, right? And those typically, I was reading an article in the New York Times yesterday talking about the number of private companies has shot up dramatically in the US.
Mm-hmm.
There's far fewer public companies in the US today than there ever have been as a percentage of companies over a certain scale. Partly because of the disclosures are so much less being private, of course. So, it's that bit. My contention would be that the biggest accelerant to those trends that you highlighted is actually making this economically return, so the capital does move, right?
Yeah.
To these spaces, and we're still very far away from having a global carbon compliance scheme.
Yeah, we're still far away. I'm not even sure if that will ever come into existence, Paul. So I think that we should be happy if there's a few big, let's call them markets out there that would actually price carbon. But more to your point on because I think that's where you were heading in terms of pricing the externalities, right? I mean, they've never been priced. I can go to my local supermarket and buy pizza that I can put in the oven, right? And it's costing me €3.99. Well, there's no way that you can actually get that. I mean, it doesn't reflect any of the externalities, let alone that it probably is that it actually represents a positive margin to my supermarket, right? And to the producer of that pizza. So my point is that the real price of that pizza is probably is a multiple of that $3.99. But we've never priced that. We've never had that taxation, if you will, of externalities. And that's what we're actually seeing today. If you think about the essence of carbon, you take a step back and you're saying, well, forget about the carbon trading and everything else. What does carbon actually represent? Carbon represents the externality, one of the externalities of growing food. And it's totally okay to price that. I have absolutely zero problem with that. We just haven't done it for the last, 5 decades, from however long our system has been producing food in this way, and it's okay. And to your question, am I hopeful? Yes, because I can see a willingness downstream to pay that externality. Now, is that endless? No, it's not endless. I think at the end of the day, there's a ceiling to that. But I would say we're taking a serious step at pricing externalities of producing our food and moving our food around the world. That's just one example. Let's give it a try. I think that's a good development. But we've never done that before. It's only recently that we started paying for ecosystem services.
Yeah. And then we're in a world of social justice, right? Everyone paying the same for a pizza around the world is it's a very complex subject, as you say. Well, I've really appreciated you coming on, Robert. It's been fascinating, and I'd love to have you back on again in the future and see where we stand, because I do think this is such a, as you say, it's a critical topic to the sector, but it's also other commodity sectors are also energies facing exactly the same.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of coalescence around, obviously, the solutions in transportation and so forth. But fascinating to have you on.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure, Paul. It was good to have this conversation, and it's I'm glad you dedicated one podcast to this fascinating world of how we grow food and decarbonize our system.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.